Welcome to Mental Disabilities and the Criminal Justice System. I'm Elizabeth Kelley. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I specialize in representing people with mental disabilities. On this podcast, we talk to experts in the field. We try and provide information and hope to people with mental disabilities ensnared in the criminal justice system, as well as to their families. And today, we are excited to have with us Professor Colleen Berryessa, who is a professor of criminology at Rutgers University, who has a wide breadth of knowledge across the field of mental disabilities, and in particular, has a wide body of knowledge in the field of autism spectrum disorders. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. And as I said in the intro, you know lots of things about lots of different fields, but in particular, you have an expertise in autism spectrum disorders. Tell us how you discovered that field.
Sure. So, for pretty much as long as I can remember, I was really interested in kind of the nexus of psychology and criminal justice. And I would say that, a long time ago, at very, very early stages, even before I really started my actual career, I had taken some classes in college, and there had been a class that I had been really interested in about neuropsychology of violent behavior. And I ended up writing a paper after thinking about, a variety of different topics as the final paper for that class on autism. I had never had any sort of experience or background in autism up to that point. And I realized it was not only a really interesting area, there just wasn't a lot of work on it. And so, by the time that I, finished up that paper, found it to be really intriguing. Flash forward about 5 years, I was doing a pre-doctoral fellowship at Stanford before I went and got my PhD. And one of the things that, was kind of at the top of mind were thinking about research projects and things to do. And I kind of reflected back on my research that I had done during that class and, thought that autism might be something that would be a really good area that, there hadn't been a lot of specific work on legal decision-making and how people in the court system think about autism and deal with defendants with autism. And so that really kind of set the stage. And now, 10 years after that, I am still really interested in it. And it continues to be a very important part of my research agenda.
And I should mention for benefit of our listeners that Professor Berryessa did her undergraduate work at Harvard and completed her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And from your writings and your speaking, you have cultivated a real expertise in the importance of an expert in criminal cases involving people with autism spectrum disorders. What can an expert bring to those cases?
That's a great question. So as I had mentioned, when I had first been really interested in this area, I realized there just wasn't a lot of work on how legal decision makers thought about autism, how they used evidence in relation to autism or the diagnosis in their decision making and how it potentially impacts court. And obviously alongside that is how important expert testimony and evidence might be in that process, considering that most people are not experts in autism, and people who are making decisions in the courtroom, judges, jury members, as well as anyone else who works with people who are being processed through the legal system, like attorneys or prosecutors. They wouldn't be expected to be experts. And so I have found through a lot of my work that there's a lot of misunderstandings, which we can talk about, that people can misunderstand the behaviors associated with autism. People can misperceive it as being potentially negative qualities. All of those things, unless they are kind of appropriately discussed and illuminated by a person who has this kind of background in court, can often lead to negative views of these individuals, which can later impact decision making. And so with some of the work that I have done, especially on experts, I did a study in 2017 where experts talked about what they want to bring to cases involving autism and what they think their general roles and goals are in that in that kind of experience of giving expert testimony and evidence. And some of the things that they mention are related to communicating aspects of the disorder. So they need to act as the educators and communicate important diagnostic qualities, and really be able to convey how a person might be misunderstood, both within the courtroom, but also in relation to the case characteristics or the offending behavior that a person's on trial for. So really being able to kind of fully communicate and educate people within the courtroom about this person and how their diagnosis may have affected what has happened and what's going on currently. And then some of the other things that experts had talked about was related to myth dispelling. So this idea that sometimes the media can portray people with autism as having particular qualities. It could be something related to, quirkiness or specific interests or things like that. But it also can unfortunately, in some cases, connect violence with autism. And there have been some high-profile cases that have led people in the kind of general public to sometimes think that people with autism are likely to be violent when that is not the case. And so experts talk about acting as dispellers of these myths and trying to really combat some of the misunderstandings that the media can portray about autism and criminality and offending. And then the last thing that the experts really talked about was this idea of being a reconstructionist. So being able to draw from some of the qualities and things that they're communicating to the court about the diagnosis and really effectively connect it to what has occurred and in both relation to explaining the offending, but then also in relation to kind of what might be best for this person. Is incarceration or an alternative sentence potentially the most beneficial? How will they understand these punishments? Being able to reconstruct what has happened in the past and what's currently happening to help try to figure out how decisions should be made in the best possible way. And all of those, involve a lot of education and a lot of background and a lot of expertise that we just don't unfortunately see with most people in the criminal justice system. And so that means that experts are vitally important and in fact are probably the most important thing for a person with autism, especially if they've been either misdiagnosed or their diagnosis isn't fully known, because otherwise it can be very difficult for them to have a very kind of thorough and effective and successful legal process, and it can lead to an unfortunate kind of bunch of negative consequences if it's not there.
I want to clarify a few points. First of all, when you talk about an expert assisting the defense in explaining the behavior and the vulnerabilities of someone on the spectrum, are you talking about the actual forensic evaluation that is conducted of this individual that may include interviews and testing and review of other collateral documents? Or are you talking about having an expert specifically testify for benefit of the judge or the jury about the nexus between the autism and the conduct charged?
That's a good question. So I think it can be both. So I mean, with the first example that you gave, that person is there to evaluate the defendant and is really there to be able to do exactly what you mentioned, a forensic clinical evaluation where you're talking to someone, you are either diagnosing them or being able to solidify or clarify the symptoms that they may be showing, how that might be related to offending behavior or the case characteristics, and then even sometimes current behavior. While the latter, which is also very important, but plays a different role, which is much more of a kind of a general education about how autism might affect a person's behavior in life, in personal interactions and social interactions, in the courtroom. So you might have somebody who comes in and talks about provides some sort of understanding to the court on if there are ways in which a courtroom environment can be modified. Maybe that's the ways in which those, that person should be move to a different courtroom, the light should be dimmed. Maybe they're sat in a particular area or in a different way that makes them feel more comfortable. Maybe they're provided with a person to help assist them during cross-examination or during questioning. So I think that both of those play a really important role, but they just play different roles. And it really depends on the case at hand, one of which obviously is very specific to the defendant about that person, their autism, and how it might be related to both their offending and then also courtroom behavior. And the other one is more just general knowledge to contextualize some things about the disorder itself and how it may impact kind of a variety of different things, both during offending and then in the courtroom.
Let's drill down to your concept of educating the courtroom. What kind of myths do jurors as well as judges come into the courtroom with concerning people on the spectrum, keeping in mind that the term spectrum itself encompasses a wide body of behavior?
No, and that is a really good point. So definitely the spectrum is something that people don't necessarily always understand. The majority of the work that I have done and a lot of the other work that people have done in kind of similar spheres, either in the US or outside of the US, have largely been on high functioning autism. So what used to be known as Aspergers Syndrome, and people who are generally able to live independently, who have normal intelligence, and often the main kind of symptomatic presentation of their autism are those social and communication impairments. And in that context, since that's the area that a lot of the work that has been done on this area has focused on the spectrum, there is still a lot of misunderstanding that not everyone with autism is fully intellectually disabled. People cannot, maybe people are not able to speak or not able to live independently. So there's already sometimes an automatic assumption that autism means intellectually disabled, or having those more low, like being lower on the spectrum and having a more cognitive impairments. When it comes to higher functioning, since that is the kind of area of interest for people who do work in this area, since those individuals are the ones that you often will see in these contexts, and they are ones in which competency and some of the other issues that you may see with other individuals with disabilities, that they're not as relevant just because they have normal intelligence and are able to live independently. A bunch of the misunderstandings that I have at least seen, and I've talked about with judges and jurors before, really relates to the relationship between violence and autism, and then also some of the kind of quirkiness that may be associated with some of the mass media or fictional media portrayals of autism. So things like Big Bang Theory and some of the other TV shows that have portrayed individuals who have what we think of as Aspergers Syndrome. A lot of people think of people with high functioning autism as having those characteristics or being similar to some of the kind of famous TV characters on those. So you got a lot of very specific things around related to fixated interests. It could be comic books or trains or things like that. And it could be, being either very smart or very quirky in these different ways. So there's often a misunderstanding. And when people talk about that area of the spectrum, they sometimes think of these kind of famous characters. And then when it comes to criminality, I was just going to say the last thing, the criminality, some unfortunate things that have happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that there has been some high profile cases in which a person either has been or more likely is just assumed to or speculated to have this high functioning autism. And people like Adam Lanza, who was the mass shooter in Sandy Hook in 2012, he was someone who, there was a lot of speculation and a lot of scapegoating after that incident that he had Asperger's Syndrome or had high functioning autism. And that kind of already reinforced some of the prior mass media portrayals of some individuals with high functioning autism having a higher likelihood for violence or mass shootings. And so nowadays, every once in a while, when something occurs, someone will bring this up and say, I wonder if this person has Asperger's or has high functioning autism, just because there had been, some prior way long ago research that hasn't really been solidified or really shown to be robust in any way. And some of these misunderstandings by the media, that has continued to kind of seep into the psyche of people in the general public. And since those people who are, are judges and are jurors and are active in the criminal justice system, as decision makers in a lot of these cases, sometimes they'll take these, either fictional or misportrayed aspects of autism and let it kind of bleed into some of their decisions, and they'll just misunderstand some of the symptoms and other things, and especially when it comes to future outcomes, the likelihood for dangerous and things like that. Unfortunately, a lot of these kind of prior portrayals can really do a disservice to the autism community.
So I think what you're trying to say is that you and other experts in the field try to emphasize to judges and jurors that just because someone is on the spectrum, that person is not necessarily more predisposed to committing acts of violence than a so-called neurotypical person, correct?
Yes, so that is definitely, and I would say that this isn't just specific to autism. I think this would go be an important point for a lot of different mental disorders and psychiatric illnesses. But yes, definitely for autism, since it has unfortunately been something that has been portrayed in the mass media in the last 20 years, that is something very important for everyone who's involved in the criminal justice system, who's making decisions on behalf or in relation to cases involving people with autism. Just because if you're making decisions because you think this person is predisposed to violence or criminality or future danger, when in fact there is absolutely no predisposition, and in fact you are far less likely to have this person be a danger in the future as compared to someone in the neurotypical population, it's just really important, because even though judges, again, may not necessarily want to use these to make decisions, and it may bleed into their subconscious and implicitly affect some of their decisions, because they draw from some of these prior media cases that they've seen, and therefore just make assumptions that this person is going to be violent.
So if a defense attorney wants to impress upon the court that given proper services, that individual on the spectrum will not reoffend, will not commit another act of violence, what sort of services should that defense attorney specify that would be important, that indeed would be necessary?
That's a really good question. So I think during the court process, so there's two things. So the first is, again, having a set of services that might be available during the actual trial or court process, where a person can be given alternatives, an alternative setting or environment, maybe being asked questions in a different way that may make more sense and make them feel more comfortable and less likely to either say things or do things that would lead to some of these negative understandings. When it comes to outcomes and thinking about what might be a good outcome for a person who has autism in a criminal case, when it is a conviction may occur and you're thinking about what might be the next step after this conviction, sentencing alternatives are always going to be extremely more beneficial to individuals with autism as compared to kind of normal either periods of probation or incarceration. Sometimes people with autism have issues with keeping with probation stipulations, and again, they're not alone. There's a lot of other mental disorders and disabilities where people have a lot of issues, getting to court on time, following a strict set of rules, and they may end up doing technical violations, which can mean that their probation is revoked. And so a lot of those things can be very difficult just because of the symptoms of the disorder. So sometimes periods of probation can be very difficult. Incarceration is pretty much maybe the worst thing, in the sense that it can be very, very difficult for people to enter, an incarceration facility and feel the anxiety and stress and be placed in a location that makes them feel very uncomfortable. That can lead them to, lash out or react, which could lead to more infractions, which could keep them in incarcerated settings longer. And there's actually been quite a bit of research to suggest that because incarceration is, either you argue, depending on your punishment philosophy, that it's there to either, incapacitate a person because they're dangerous, or it's to make them think about, what they did in the past, and, help them reflect and maybe become a better person for it. In that context, if for most people or many individuals with many defendants with autism, neither of these things are helpful because they're not going to be a high likelihood of risk in the future, and they're not going to be able to understand that reflection necessarily. And that means that incarceration will only have negative health and psychological and emotional effects for them. And so sentencing alternatives are always going to be the best: mental health treatment, mental health diversion, providing, some sort of, change of environment, maybe because that might be the thing that has led to the offending. It could be therapy or patient treatment, community service, other things that allow them to kind of stay in their own environment, have a routine, but also keep them within their comfort zone and allow them to kind of do things to better themselves and to better their outcomes. So in general, sentencing alternatives are always going to be the best.
And I want to add that because of various sensory issues that people on the spectrum often experience, prison or jail can be extremely inappropriate.
Yeah.
And indeed, the sights, the smells, the textures, the noises of a prison or a jail sentence can constitute absolute torture for someone on the spectrum. I want to pivot now for our listeners and tell them that you have a new book coming out. You are the co-editor of a book titled Neuro Law in the Courtroom. And I want you to tell us a bit more about the book, and depending upon when people are listening to this podcast, if they can join your virtual book launch.
Sure. So yes, I have a collaborator of mine from the University of Sunderland in the United Kingdom. She and I have an edited book that is coming out later in the year. The book launch will be on July 28th. So from today is about 6 weeks. But again, as you said, it depends on when the podcast is being listened to. But it is a launch for this amazing edited volume about neuroscientific perspectives of vulnerable defendants in the courtroom, and specifically how neuroscience can be used to create more equitable and successful outcomes for different types of vulnerable defendants across the world. So it's an international collection. There are 6 amazing chapters from 6 different contributor groups, I guess, because a couple of them have several authors. And we have people who are writing from Germany and Italy, and in a variety of other different countries, including the United States. And all of the chapters cover different material, but all are really related to how neuroscience can and maybe cannot help the outcomes of different types of vulnerable defendants, whether that be with mental illness, whether that be related to age, or making decisions on behalf of people who have more vulnerable qualities, people who have social ills, or have kind of gone through traumatic upbringings. All of those things may be aided in some way by neuroscientific understandings of these characteristics. And in some cases, some of the legal decision-making processes and the courts can kind of think and turn to neuroscience, and that might be something that can help them maybe better understand those characteristics and make more kind of just decisions on the behalf of these defendants. So yes, I'm happy to plug the book launch, and it is a free book launch on July 28th in the morning in the US, and in the afternoon in most places in Europe, and it is free to attend.
And when you earlier use the phrase, how neuroscience can help, specifically by that, what do you mean? The testimony of a neuropsychiatrist or a neuropsychologist, neuroimaging, what?
Yeah, so it kind of takes shape in different ways through the book and in general in the kind of area of neuro law, which is where this book lies within kind of the academic spectrum. It really depends on the type of case, but yes, it involves being able to have experts and testimony and evidence that's provided as it relates to neuroscience. It could be, related to a specific defendant, to specific characteristics, and the kind of education we were talking about with autism that also might be related to, educating people in the courtroom about the neuroscience of particular characteristics like trauma or things like that. But it also is just using neuroscience to understand decision-making, to better understand the behavior of others, as well as our own decisions and behavior, as well as trying to contextualize in some cases how we might maybe not be making decisions as well as we could, and because we just have kind of just general deficits to how we make decisions as humans and what our brains are allowed to do in kind of our cognitive architecture. So this book kind of covers, and neurolaw kind of covers neuroscience kind of across these different spheres, and basically looks to see how neuroscience can help the law make better decisions.
In other words, you're trying to convey that behavior, indeed decision making, is brain-based, correct?
Yes. So it's connecting behavior with the brain and with biology, and recognizing that we're not one or the other. They are together and kind of inherently intertwined. But it would be a disservice to not think about how our behavior stems from these biological processes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Professor Berryessa, for joining us, and we appreciate all of the contributions you have made, and it sounds as if you are continuing to make to the field of autism spectrum disorder, and in particular, how people with autism are ensnared in the criminal justice system and how they can extricate themselves. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.